presidency. A few hours later, he received a long telegram from his campaign manager in Chicago. "Do not come here, for God's sake. You will be telegraphed by others to come. It is the united advice of your friends not to come. This is important." Judge David Davis, with whom Lincoln had ridden the circuit in his early days, had used his suite in Chicago's Tremont House as a lookout post. Seward's men broke down and cried like little children, he recalled. They were in a frenzy beside themselves with fury at their loss. It would have been disastrous for Mr. Lincoln to have come to the convention. That would have required them to face him in person. Accepting the advice of his longtime friend, nominee Lincoln remained in Springfield. Soon he agreed to a new set of suggestions. He was to go nowhere on anything that might seem to be a political mission. He was to write nothing and say nothing on any doctrinal issue. He was to stay away from rallies held on his behalf, even in Springfield. When German-born Karl Schurz came to Springfield to make a speech in midsummer, it was the only time the candidate disobeyed instructions. Wearing his customary linen duster, Lincoln put on his stovepipe hat and walked to the Capitol in order to applaud Karl Schurz. His followers were not so careful. Republican wideawakes staged parades in New York City. Boston created a rail splitters battalion whose sole requirement for membership was that a man had to be at least 6 feet 4 inches tall, Lincoln's own height, and a full 12 inches taller than his rival, Stephen A. Douglas. Boston's rail splitters and the voters of the nation believed that they were backing a man of the people who split rails for a living when he was young. Mr. Lincoln really was born somewhere in Kentucky, Judge Davis once told a group of intimates. He really is almost entirely self-educated, and he may have split a few rails sometime in his boyhood. But the public figure and the private man are not the same. Everybody is calling him Honest Abe. Never dare call him Abe to his face, the judge warned. He despises that nickname. Most of those listening intently to Lincoln's campaign manager knew that the candidate's wife, the former Mary Todd of Lexington, Kentucky, came from an aristocratic family. They also knew, as did everyone in and around Springfield, that Abraham Lincoln was no run-of-the-mill backwoods lawyer. Prodded on this topic, Judge Davis became expansive. He explained, "Mr. Lincoln is an all-purpose attorney. He has always stood ready to accept any client. He has argued cases on murder, disputed wills, maritime law, foreclosures, and debt. He has defended horse thieves, land grabbers, and accused rapists. Most of you men here know that Mr. Lincoln defended several accused murderers, but how many of you remember that he also acted as court-appointed prosecutor in several murder cases? During 23 years of legal practice, Mr. Lincoln was involved in several thousand cases. He was always a lawyer's lawyer who handled a great many appeals. Some of them went all the way to the Illinois Supreme Court. He argued the sandbar case involving ownership of shoreland at the mouth of the Chicago River before the U.S. Supreme Court and won. No matter what the professional politicians say, Mr. Lincoln has come about as far from the log cabin as a man can get. Remember the Illinois Central Railroad case? He was representing the railroad and won. When When he gave them his bill for $20,000, railroad executives laughed and handed him a check for $200. What did Mr. Lincoln do then? He took the case to a jury and asked for the $18,800 he figured that the Illinois Central still owed him. He got a judgment, but the railroad refused to pay. So the man the country calls a rail splitter got a sheriff's order for seizure of the property of the biggest corporation in Illinois. You can bet that they paid him in a hurry. Long before the tall man in the stovepipe hat was ready to take up residence in the White House, the outcome envisioned by Stephen A. Douglas had become a reality. Some militant southern states had already seceded. Others appeared poised to follow. By February 1861, Lincoln had disposed much of his personal property. Springfield druggist S. H. Melvin responded to an advertisement in the State Journal and became the owner of a parlor and chamber sets, carpets, sofas, chairs, and glass. His handwritten bill of sale presented to him by the president-elect included acknowledgement of the receipt of $4.75 for 9½ yards of stair carpet. As Lincoln prepared to take the long and circuitous railroad journey to the nation's capital, his intimates became alarmed. They retained Allen Pinkerton, a pioneer private detective, to arrange for the security of the president-elect on the trip. Pinkerton was especially bothered by the climate of opinion in Baltimore, half of whose citizens openly supported the seceded states. A change of trains there would require a ride through streets that could potentially be filled with rioters. Anything could happen in such a situation. That is the reason why Pinkerton persuaded the reluctant president-elect to leave off his now familiar hat and to dress as inconspicuously as possible in muff tie for the Baltimore leg of his journey to Washington. Although he was never actually disguised, once his foes learned of the Baltimore transfer carefully timed to occur late at night, they bragged that he had traveled incognito. Secessionist newspapers crowded that the man who wants to be the head of the nation crept through Baltimore in disguise like a thief in the night. Cartoonist Thomas Nast sketched a version of the incident depicting Lincoln clad in a plaid with a Scottish cap. At the Illustrated London News, artists showed him sneaking through Baltimore wearing a slouched hat that concealed his face. But the most widely circulated lampoon of the cautious transfer in Baltimore came from the pen of an amateur artist. Dentist Aldebert J. Volk portrayed a frightened Lincoln peering from a railroad boxcar at a snarling cat. Disguise or no disguise in Baltimore, Washington was in a state of near frenzy. Fresh rumors circulated every day. A contingent of South Carolina militia wearing civilian clothing was on the way to the capital with rifles and plenty of ammunition. Edmund Ruffin, a notoriously outspoken Virginia advocate of slavery, had hired an outlaw to assassinate the president during the inaugural parade. Lincoln reached Washington ahead of schedule about 6 a.m., February 23rd, 1861. In drizzling rain, he stepped off the train without fanfare, without reception, a solitary figure in the early morning mist. At Richmond on the previous day, Jefferson Davis, who had been inaugurated were stationed on roofs of houses along Pennsylvania Avenue. Their commander, General Stone, had given specific orders. Watch all of the windows on the opposite side of the street. Keep your rifles at the ready. If there is any attempt to fire upon the presidential carriage from a window, you are ordered to direct a volley at the source of the attempted assassination. Accompanied by an outgoing President James Buchanan, Lincoln rode to the ceremonies in an open carriage, but squadrons of cavalry formed a moving protective barrier on the right and on the left of the carriage. Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office from trembling Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, who had shaped the Dred Scott decision. In his inaugural address, he pleaded with the already formed Confederate States of America. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory will yet swell the chord of the Union, the chorus of the Union, when again touched as surely as they will be by the better angels of our nature. Few who listened that day, and hardly any who later read Lincoln's words in print, took them seriously. Southerners and their sympathizers did not believe that the new president meant what he said when he promised that the government will not assail you. Abe Lincoln may have managed to slip through Baltimore in disguise, said an aide to Jefferson Davis, but when the shooting starts, he'll have no place to hide.